Choose any daughter you want, the father said, his voice smooth like he was offering wine instead of flesh and blood. And in that moment, under the warm golden lights of a Seoul penthouse that smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive perfume, something invisible in the room shifted, because this wasn't a family gathering. It was a transaction, and everyone knew it except the girl standing at the very end of the line, half hidden behind her sisters, as if even the air had decided she didn't deserve space. Her name was Mai, but no one called it. Not tonight. Not when there were prettier names to offer, softer faces to display, lighter skin to admire. And as the camera of attention swept across the row of daughters like a silent auction, each one stepped forward with practiced smiles, shoulders back, eyes bright, while Mai stayed still, her hands clasped in front of her, fingers pressing into each other just enough to feel something real, something grounding, because she had learned a long time ago that stillness made you invisible, and invisibility made you safe. This one, the father gestured toward the tallest, his tone almost proud, studied abroad, speaks English fluently. Then another, this one dances very graceful. And laughter followed, light and approving, the kind that wrapped around the room like silk, but never once reached the corner where Mai stood, her dress slightly too tight at the seams, her presence quietly edited out of the scene. And when someone finally noticed her, it wasn't kindness that followed, but a low murmur, a careless whisper. What about her? And the father didn't hesitate, didn't soften, didn't even glance back before answering. She's extra. The word hung in the air, polite on the surface, cruel underneath. Not exactly what most people are looking for. A few guests chuckled under their breath. Not loudly, just enough, just subtle enough to make it hurt without ever being called out. And Mai lowered her eyes. Not in shame, but in familiarity, because this was not new. This was routine. This was the quiet rhythm of her life. Ignored, dismissed, set aside. And yet, something was different tonight, something she couldn't name. Maybe it was the silence that followed, heavier than before, or maybe it was the man who hadn't spoken yet. Kang Ji-hyun stood near the center of the room, perfectly still, his dark suit, cutting clean lines against the soft glow of the chandeliers. His presence not loud, but undeniable, the kind that made conversations hesitate and laughter fade a second too early. And when his gaze moved, it didn't skim, it didn't wander, it settled, slow and deliberate, like he was reading something no one else could see. And for a brief, impossible second, it landed on Mai, really landed, not passing over her, not avoiding her, but seeing her, and she felt it. Not like a spotlight, not like judgment, but like recognition, and it made her chest tighten in a way she didn't understand, because no one had ever looked at her like that before, not her family, not the guests, not anyone. And then just as quickly, the moment passed, or at least it seemed to, because the father cleared his throat, eager, smiling again. So he said, gesturing wide, choose any daughter you want. And the room leaned in, expecting the obvious, expecting beauty, expecting status, expecting something that made sense, but Ji-hyun didn't move immediately, didn't rush, didn't follow the script written for him. Instead, he took a single step forward, his shoes quiet against the marble floor, his eyes scanning the line once more before stopping exactly where no one else would look. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost effortless, but it cut through the room like a clean line. I'll take her. And for a second, no one understood, because the world they believed in didn't allow that answer, didn't recognize that choice, until the silence broke and every head turned, slowly, inevitably, toward the girl at the end of the line, the one who was never meant to be chosen. The room did not react all at once. It fractured, first a pause, then a ripple, then a quiet, disbelieving murmur that moved from one corner to another like a slow wave, because what Kang Ji-hyun had just said did not fit the script anyone had prepared for this night. And the father's smile, still frozen in place, began to tighten at the edges as if it no longer knew how to exist in this new reality. I think there has been a misunderstanding, he said quickly, stepping forward with a soft laugh that did not reach his eyes. Perhaps he did not see clearly. There are better options. His hand gestured again, toward the line of daughters, each one now standing a little straighter, their confidence returning in fragile bursts, waiting for the correction, waiting for the moment when logic would restore itself. But Ji-hyun did not look at them. Not even for a second. His gaze remained exactly where it had been, steady, unshaken, anchored on Mai, as if she were the only person in the room who had not changed. And that was when the whispers sharpened, no longer subtle, no longer hidden. Is he serious? Someone said under their breath. Why her? Another voice followed, softer but sharper. She does not even belong here. And Mai felt each word land without needing to lift her head, because she had heard versions of them her entire life. Different rooms, different people, same conclusion. And yet this time, something inside her resisted the familiar instinct to disappear. Because the silence that followed those whispers was not the same as before. It was heavier, expectant, almost watching. And then the father tried again, his tone dropping into something more controlled, more careful. She is not prepared for this kind of arrangement, he said, choosing his words like stepping stones. She lacks the refinement. A few guests nodded in agreement, relieved to hear the world correcting itself. But Ji-hyun's response came without hesitation, without emotion, just a quiet certainty that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. I did not ask for refinement, he said, and the room stilled again, completely this time. As if even the air had decided to listen, I made my choice, and that was when something finally broke in the father's expression, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the smallest shift of his jaw, the flicker of calculation behind his eyes, because this was no longer a negotiation. This was a decision he could not control, and control was the only language he understood. So he turned, slowly, deliberately, toward Mai for the first time that night, really looking at her, not as background, not as inconvenience, but as consequence. And the look he gave her was not kind. It was sharp, measuring, almost accusing, as if her very existence had just created a problem he did not know how to solve. Step forward, he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier charm. And for a moment, Mai did not move. Not because she did not hear him, but because her body had not yet caught up to what was happening, this shift, this impossible change in direction. And then, slowly, she stepped out from the line, one step, then another, the sound of her shoes against the marble floor louder than it should have been, or maybe the room was just that quiet, every eye now fixed on her, not ignoring, not dismissing, but watching, evaluating, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of being seen, not as absence, but as presence, and it was unfamiliar, unsettling, almost overwhelming, her shoulders instinctively drawing in, her hands tightening again in front of her. But when she finally lifted her gaze just slightly, she did not look at the guests. She did not look at her father. She looked at the man who had chosen her, because she needed to understand why. And what she found there was not what she expected. There was no amusement, no cruelty, no hint that this was a joke or a mistake, only a calm, unreadable focus, as if he had already seen something in her that the rest of the room had refused to acknowledge. And that realization did not comfort her. It unsettled her even more, because it meant this was real, entirely real, and somewhere behind her, one of her sisters let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "This has to be a joke," she whispered, but no one answered, because no one in that room, not even the father, could deny what had just happened. The choice had been made, and for the first time in her life, Mai was not the one left behind. She was the one standing in the center, and no one knew what to do with that. The moment should have ended there, with a decision spoken and accepted, but nothing in that room moved forward. It only stretched, pulled thin by disbelief and quiet resistance, as if reality itself was waiting for someone powerful enough to rewrite what had just happened. And in that suspended silence, Mai became aware of something she had never felt before. Not fully, not this sharply. The weight of attention that did not pass over her but stayed, settled, pressed in from every direction. And it made the air feel heavier in her lungs, because being ignored had always been easier than being seen. Her entire life had been built around that understanding. Mornings that began before anyone else woke. Helping in the kitchen where her presence was useful but unnoticed. Afternoons spent in corners of rooms where conversations flowed around her without interruption. Evenings where laughter belonged to others, and she learned to measure her own voice, to keep it soft, to keep it rare. Because every time she had tried to step forward, even as a child, there had always been a correction, a gentle pushback, a reminder that she was not meant to take up space the way her sisters did, not meant to shine, not meant to be chosen. And so she had adapted quietly, efficiently, until invisibility became second nature, until it felt safer than hope. But now, standing a few feet away from Kang Ji-hyun, that entire structure began to crack, not loudly, not visibly, but somewhere inside her where instinct met fear, because he had undone it with a single sentence, and she did not understand why, and that not knowing was more unsettling than any insult she had ever endured. The father cleared his throat again, but this time the sound did not carry authority, it carried tension, the kind that comes when control slips just out of reach. "We will need to discuss terms," he said, his voice measured, careful, trying to regain ground. But even as he spoke, his eyes flickered between Ji-hyun and Mai, as if recalculating her value in real time, as if she had suddenly become something else entirely, something unfamiliar. And Mai felt that shift too, not as pride, not as satisfaction, but as a strange, quiet distance from the person she had been just minutes ago, the version of herself that belonged to this house, to this role, to this pattern of being overlooked, because that version no longer fit the space she was now standing in. One of her sisters stepped forward slightly, unable to hold back. Her voice edged with disbelief. "You cannot be serious," she said, her eyes fixed on Ji-hyun, but her words aimed like a blade toward Mai. "There are better choices right in front of you." And the emphasis on better lingered just long enough to sting, but Ji-hyun did not react, not to the tone, not to the challenge, not even to the implication. Instead, he shifted his attention, just slightly, enough to acknowledge the interruption. And when he spoke, it was not louder, not harsher, but final in a way that left no room for negotiation. "I do not choose based on what is presented to me," he said. "I choose based on what I see." And the distinction settled into the room like a quiet verdict, because it implied something none of them wanted to consider, that what they had presented was not the same as what was real. And for the first time, Mai felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not confidence, not yet, but a fragile awareness that maybe, just maybe, she had been seen differently all along, just not by the people who mattered most in her life. She lowered her gaze again, not to disappear, but to steady herself, to hold on to that thought before it slipped away. And as the room remained suspended between expectation and reality, between what should have happened and what already had, one truth became impossible to ignore. The girl who had spent her entire life at the edge of every room was no longer standing there. She was in the center now, and nothing about that felt safe, but for the first time, it felt real. No one applauded. No one spoke, because the moment had moved past explanation and into something far less comfortable, something that required everyone in that room to quietly reconsider what they thought they understood about value. And yet the evening did not end. It shifted, like a scene resetting itself without changing the cast, as assistants appeared from the edges of the room with soft steps and lowered eyes, as glasses were refilled, as the music resumed, just slightly louder than before. All the small signals of normalcy attempting to smooth over what could not be undone. But beneath that surface, tension remained, sharp and unspoken, and at the center of it stood Mai, no longer hidden, no longer background, but not yet belonging anywhere else either. "You will come with me," Kang Ji-hyun said, not as a command that demanded obedience, but as a statement that assumed it. And Mai felt those words settle differently than anything else spoken that night, because they did not reduce her, did not categorize her. They simply moved her forward, and for a brief second she hesitated, not out of refusal, but because leaving meant something final, something irreversible. It meant stepping out of the only world she had ever known, even if that world had never truly held her. And when she turned slightly, her eyes found her father again, searching for something she could not quite name, perhaps acknowledgement, perhaps resistance, perhaps anything that resembled care, but what she found instead was calculation, quiet and immediate, his mind already moving ahead, already reshaping the narrative to fit his advantage. And when he finally spoke, his tone had changed completely, smoother now, almost accommodating. "Of course," he said, nodding as if this had always been the plan. "We will ensure everything is prepared properly." And Mai understood then, with a clarity that surprised even herself, that she had never truly been seen as a daughter in this room. Not even in this moment. She was an asset being reassigned, nothing more, nothing less. Her sisters stood in silence, but their expressions said enough. Disbelief still lingered, but now it was mixed with something sharper, something closer to resentment, because the order they had relied on, the quiet hierarchy that had always placed them above her, had been disrupted in a way none of them could correct, and Mai felt that shift like a subtle pressure against her back, not pushing her forward, but reminding her that she no longer fit behind them. "You should go," one of them said finally, her voice controlled but tight, as if forcing composure. And for a moment, Mai almost smiled, not out of joy, but out of recognition, because even now, the dismissal came easily, instinctively, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She turned back toward Ji-hyun, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each step needed to be chosen, not assumed. And when she reached his side, she noticed something she had not seen before, not clearly, the way he stood, not imposing, not towering over her, but aligned as if he had adjusted his presence to meet hers rather than overwhelm it, and that subtle shift unsettled her more than anything else, because it suggested intention, not accident. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond them, and Mai hesitated again, not because she lacked the words, but because there were too many possible answers, none of them certain. And so she chose the only honest one she had. "No," she said, her voice steady despite everything. And for the first time, something almost like approval flickered in his expression. Not a smile, not warmth, but recognition of truth, and he nodded once, as if that answer was enough for now. The doors to the penthouse opened with a soft, almost silent motion, revealing the night beyond. The city lights of Seoul stretching out in every direction, distant and untouchable, and as Mai stepped toward that threshold, she felt the weight of the room behind her begin to loosen, not disappear, but fade just enough to allow something else to take its place, something unfamiliar, something uncertain. And as she crossed that line, leaving behind the space where she had always been invisible, one quiet realization followed her into the night. She had not been chosen because she was the least. She had been chosen because someone had seen something no one else had even tried to look for. And that difference, that single, silent distinction, was about to change everything. The elevator doors closed with a soft, seamless motion, cutting off the last trace of voices from the penthouse. And in that instant, the silence inside the mirrored space felt different, not heavy like before, but contained, controlled, as if everything beyond those walls had already been decided and left behind. And Mai stood still beside Kang Ji-hyun, her reflection staring back at her from every angle, multiplied, unavoidable. And for the first time in years, she could not look away from herself, not because she wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to look, and that alone made her uneasy. The ride down was smooth, almost weightless, but each passing second seemed to stretch longer than the last, her thoughts catching up in fragments, questions forming without answers. Why her? What did he see? What did this mean? And none of them found a place to land because the man standing next to her remained silent, not distant, not cold, just deliberate, as if he understood that whatever needed to be said would not come from words in this moment. When the doors opened again, the night air greeted them immediately, cool and steady, carrying the distant hum of the city below, and waiting just outside was a black sedan, its surface reflecting the city lights. Like still water, a driver standing by with a quiet nod. No introduction, no unnecessary movement. Everything precise, everything expected. And yet Mai hesitated again, just a fraction of a second, her body catching on the threshold between what had been and what was now unfolding, because stepping into that car meant accepting something she still did not fully understand. "You can ask," Ji-hyun said suddenly, his voice low but clear, breaking the silence without disturbing it, and I blinked, slightly caught off guard. "Ask what?" she replied, her tone careful, not defensive, but guarded in a way she had learned to survive with. And he turned his head just enough to meet her eyes, not intensely, not forcefully, just enough to acknowledge her presence. "What you've been thinking since I said your name without saying it," he said. And for a moment, she almost looked away, almost returned to the safety of silence. But something in his tone made that impossible, not because it demanded honesty, but because it allowed it, and that was unfamiliar territory. "Why me?" she said, the words simple, direct, but carrying everything she had held back for years, every quiet dismissal, every overlooked moment, every time she had been told without words that she was not enough, and the question hung there between them. Not heavy, not fragile, just real, and Jae-hyun did not answer immediately, not because he did not have one, but because he seemed to be choosing how to give it. And when he finally spoke, his voice did not carry explanation. It carried certainty. "Because you were the only one who was not trying to be chosen," he said, and I felt something shift again, deeper this time. Not confusion, not disbelief, but recognition of a truth she had never considered valuable. And she frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in the effort to understand. "That does not make sense," she said quietly. And for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something different in his expression, not amusement, not softness, but a quiet acknowledgement. "It does, just not in the world you came from," he replied. The driver opened the car door, and Jae-hyun gestured subtly for her to enter first. Not as a test, not as a command, just a simple action that left the choice in her hands. And this time, Mai did not hesitate. She stepped forward, lowered herself into the seat, the leather cool against her skin, the interior silent and composed. And as the door closed behind her, sealing out the night, she realized something she had not expected. The fear she thought would follow her was not there, not in the way she knew it, because this was not the same kind of uncertainty she had lived with before. This was something else entirely, something that did not shrink her, did not push her back into corners, but instead held her in place, asking her to remain, to see, to understand. And as the car began to move, gliding into the flow of the city, Mai looked out at the lights passing by, each one distant and separate, and for the first time in her life, she was not wondering how to disappear among them. She was wondering what it would mean to finally exist within them, fully, without apology, and beside her. Kang Ji-hyun said nothing more, because he did not need to. The answer he had given was not the end of her question. It was only the beginning of something she had never been allowed to consider before. That being unseen had never meant she was without value. It had only meant no one had been looking in the right way. The city moved around them in quiet layers of light, glass towers reflecting one another in endless repetition, traffic flowing in smooth lines like something rehearsed, something controlled. And inside the car, the silence settled again. But it was no longer uncertain. It had changed, shaped by the words that had already been spoken, and Mai sat with her hands resting loosely in her lap, no longer gripping, no longer bracing, just still, as if she was testing what it felt like to exist without. Shrinking, she watched the reflections pass across the window, her own face appearing and disappearing between the lights. And for the first time, she did not immediately look away. She studied it, not critically, not defensively, just observing, as if seeing a version of herself she had never been introduced to before, and that alone felt unfamiliar enough to hold her attention. "Where are we going?" she asked after a while. Her voice steady, not demanding, but no longer hesitant either, and Jae-hyun answered without looking away from the road ahead. "Somewhere quiet," he said, simple, direct, and that answer, though vague, did not unsettle her the way it might have earlier, because she was beginning to understand that his choices were not random. They were deliberate, even when unexplained. The car turned away from the busier streets, moving into a quieter part of the city where the buildings stood farther apart, the lights softer, the pace slower, and eventually, it came to a smooth stop in front of a modern residence, understated in design but precise in every detail, the kind of place that did not need to announce itself to be understood. And when the door opened, Mai stepped out without hesitation this time, her eyes taking in the space around her, the clean lines, the stillness, the absence of noise that felt almost intentional. Inside, the air was calm, untouched by the tension she had left behind, and everything about the space reflected order, not excess, not display, just clarity. And Mai found herself standing just inside the entrance, unsure for a brief moment what she was expected to do, not because she needed direction, but because she had spent so long being told where she belonged that the absence of instruction felt unfamiliar. "You are not here to serve," Ji-hyun said, as if reading that exact hesitation before it could fully form. And Mai looked at him, her expression shifting slightly, not surprised, but attentive. "Then why am I here?" she asked, and this time, he turned fully toward her, not towering, not imposing, just present. "To decide what you will be without anyone deciding it for you," he said, and the words did not land immediately. They did not resolve into something simple or easy. They lingered, unfolding slowly in her mind, because the idea itself was foreign, almost impossible, a life not defined by expectation, not shaped by comparison, not measured against someone else's standard. She took a step further into the room, her movements careful but no longer withdrawn, her gaze moving across the space, noticing details she would have overlooked before, the absence of excess, the intentional simplicity, the quiet confidence in what was not displayed, and something about it felt familiar in a way she could not explain, as if it mirrored something within her that had never been acknowledged. "You speak like I have a choice," she said after a moment, her tone softer now, more thoughtful than defensive, and Jae-hyun's response came just as calmly. "You always did," he said. "You were just never given the space to see it." And Mai stood there absorbing that, not accepting it fully, not rejecting it either, just holding it, because for the first time, the question was not what others saw in her, not what she had been told she lacked, but something far more unfamiliar, something that required her to look inward instead of outward. And as the quiet of the room settled around her, one realization began to take shape, slow but undeniable. The life she had lived until now had not defined her. It had only contained her. And now, standing in a place where no one expected her to disappear, she was being asked to do something she had never been taught how to do, to exist without permission, to choose without fear. And that was not something she could understand in a single moment, but it was something she could no longer ignore. The quiet did not rush her. It waited, stretching gently across the space as if giving her room to exist inside it without pressure, without expectation. And Mai stood there longer than she realized, her eyes moving slowly across the room, tracing lines, corners, shadows, as if mapping a place that did not yet feel like hers but no longer felt unfamiliar either. And in that stillness, something subtle began to shift, not around her, but within her, because for the first time in her life there was no immediate role assigned, no task waiting, no silent instruction shaping how she should stand, how she should speak, how she should disappear. And that absence, that quiet lack of direction, was not empty, it was open. "You are not asking anything from me," she said finally, her voice low but steady, breaking the silence without disturbing it. And Ji-hyun, who had remained a few steps away, watching without intrusion, responded just as simply, "No." And that single word carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it removed the structure she had always relied on, the invisible framework that had defined her place in every room she had ever entered. Mai took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling with a calm she did not fully understand yet, and she began to walk, not toward him, not toward any specific destination, but through the space itself, her steps measured, intentional, as if each one was a decision rather than a habit. And as she moved, her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of a table, the smooth surface grounding her in a way that felt real, immediate, undeniable. "What if I choose wrong?" she asked after a moment, not looking at him, but not avoiding him either, her gaze fixed somewhere ahead as if the answer might exist, in the air between them. And Ji-hyun did not answer right away. not because he needed time, but because he seemed to understand that the question itself mattered more than the response. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, unwavering. "Then you will learn what right feels like," he said, and I paused, her steps slowing, her mind catching on the simplicity of it, because she had never been allowed that kind of process before, never been given the space to fail without consequence, to explore without judgment, to exist without comparison. She turned slightly then, her eyes meeting his again, and there was something different in her expression now, not uncertainty, not fear, but curiosity, quiet and cautious, as if she was beginning to see a path she had never been shown before, and that realization did not overwhelm her. It steadied her, because it did not demand anything, it only offered possibility. "Why do you care?" she asked, the question soft but direct, not accusatory, not suspicious, just honest. And for the first time, Ji-hyun's gaze shifted, not away, but inward, as if the answer existed somewhere deeper than words. And when he spoke, it was quieter than before, but no less certain. "Because I know what it looks like when someone is overlooked," he said, "and I know what it costs when no one corrects it." And those words did not come with explanation. They did not carry a story. But they carried weight, lived experience, something unspoken that did not need to be detailed to be understood. I held his gaze for a moment longer, not searching for more, but acknowledging what had been given. And then she nodded, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but real, because for the first time, she was not responding out of habit, not adjusting to fit, not retreating to avoid. Attention. She was choosing to remain, to engage, to consider, and that choice, simple as it was, marked something new. She turned back toward the room, her posture shifting just slightly, not larger, not louder, but present in a way that had never existed before. And as the quiet settled around her once more, it no longer felt like something she had to survive. It felt like something she could shape, something she could exist within without disappearing, and in that moment, without anyone announcing it, without any visible change to the world around her. I crossed a line that had never been drawn for her before, from being defined by what others refused to see, to beginning, slowly, deliberately, to define herself. Morning arrived quietly, not with urgency or demand, but with a soft light that filtered through the tall windows and settled across the room in warm, steady lines. And I opened her eyes to a silence that did not feel empty, but complete, the kind of silence that did not expect anything from her, did not require her to rush, to prepare, to become something before she had even fully woken. And for a moment, she remained still, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, as if anchoring herself to the unfamiliar calm, because this was not how her days had ever begun before. In her old life, mornings had been measured in tasks, in footsteps that had to be quiet, in movements that had to be efficient, in presence that had to be minimal. But here, there was nothing waiting for her except time, and that realization alone made her sit up slowly, her movements unhurried, her breath steady, as if she was learning a new rhythm without being told what it should sound like. She stepped out of the room, her bare feet soft against the floor, and followed the faint scent of coffee toward the kitchen, where Kang Ji-hyun stood near the counter, his sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the ease in his posture. Not formal, not distant, just present, and he glanced up briefly as she entered, not startled, not assessing, just acknowledging. "You are awake," he said simply, and I nodded, her eyes taking in space again, noticing details she had missed before, the way everything was arranged with purpose but without excess, the absence of anything unnecessary, and she found herself standing there for a moment, unsure if she should move closer or remain where she was, not out of fear, but out of unfamiliarity with not being directed. "You can sit," he added, gesturing lightly toward the table, and the choice was given, not imposed, and this time, Mai accepted it without hesitation, walking over and lowering herself into the chair, her posture natural, not guarded, not withdrawn, just present. And as she sat there, she noticed something small but significant. No one was watching her to correct how she held herself. No one was measuring her movements against an invisible standard, and that absence allowed her to simply be. A cup was placed in front of her, the steam rising gently, and she looked at it for a second before lifting it, her fingers wrapping around the warmth, grounding her in a moment. And when she took a sip, it was not rushed, not functional, it was experienced fully, without interruption, and that alone felt like a quiet shift she could not ignore. "What do people see when they look at you?" Ji-hyun asked after a moment, his tone calm, not probing, just curious. In my pause, the question settling in her mind as something heavier than it first appeared, because she had spent her entire life answering that without words, through the way people treated her, the way they spoke around her, the way they dismissed her without ever needing to say it directly. And now, being asked to define it herself, out loud, felt different, almost unfamiliar. "They see what they expect to see," she said finally, her voice even but thoughtful, and Ji-hyun nodded once, as if that answer aligned with something he already understood. "And what do you see?" he asked, and this time, the silence that followed was longer, not uncomfortable, but necessary, because the question did not have a ready answer, not one she had practiced, not one she had been given. And I looked down at her hands, at the way they rested on the table, steady, capable, real, and for a moment, she did not speak, not because she could not, but because she was considering something she had never been asked to consider before. And when she finally lifted her gaze again, there was something new in her expression, not certainty, not confidence, but awareness. "I do not know yet," she said, and there was no apology in her voice, no hesitation, just honesty. And that honesty did not diminish her. It defined the space she was beginning to step into. Ji-hyun did not correct her, did not fill the silence with explanation. He simply nodded, as if that answer was not lacking, but necessary. And, as the morning light continued to move slowly across the room, I realized something that had never been offered to her before. She was not expected to already know who she was. She was allowed to discover it, piece by piece, without judgment, without comparison, without being told she was already behind. And that realization did not come with a sudden change. It came quietly, steadily, like the light itself. And for the first time, the future did not feel like something she had to catch up to. It felt like something she could walk into at her own pace without being left behind. The days that followed did not announce themselves with dramatic change. They unfolded quietly, one moment at a time, each one small enough to almost go unnoticed. But together, they began to reshape something far deeper than routine, and I found herself moving through the space differently now, not as someone passing through, not as someone waiting to be corrected, but as someone allowed to remain, and that shift, subtle as it was, touched everything. She began to notice how she stood, not shrinking, not adjusting, just standing, how she spoke, not rehearsing, not filtering every word, just speaking, and how she looked at the world around her, not searching for where she did not belong, but beginning to recognize where she might. One afternoon, the stillness of the house was interrupted by a familiar presence, not loud, not disruptive, but unmistakable, as her father's voice carried faintly from the entrance, measured, controlled, but edged with something she had never heard from him before, uncertainty. And I paused where she stood, her breath steady, her posture unchanged, because the instinct to retreat, to step back, to disappear, did not come this time. It simply was not there. Kang Ji-hyun stood across from him, composed as always, his presence unchanged, but the space between them felt different, not equal, not balanced, but clear in a way that required no explanation. And when her father's eyes finally found her, there was a flicker of recognition that had never existed before, not of who she had been, but of what she had become in his absence, and it unsettled him. That much was evident in the way his words came slower than usual, more careful. "You seem well," he said, and the sentence did not finish itself, because there was no familiar version of her to attach it to anymore. I stepped forward then, not hesitantly, not cautiously, but naturally, her movements unforced, her gaze level, and for the first time, she did not look to Ji-hyun for direction. She did not measure her response against expectation. She simply answered, "I am," and those two words, simple as they were, carried something undeniable, not defiance, not pride, but truth, steady and unshaken. Her father studied her for a moment, longer than he ever had before, as if trying to reconcile the image in front of him with the one he had always dismissed. And in that silence, something became clear, not just to him, but to everyone in that room. The value he had overlooked had not disappeared. It had not diminished. It had simply been waiting for a place where it could exist without being denied. If there are arrangements to revisit, he began, his tone shifting again, searching for familiar ground. But Ji-hyun's voice cut in, not sharply, not forcefully, but with a finality that required no repetition. There is nothing to revisit, he said, and the words settled the conversation without escalation, without resistance. Just clarity. Ma did not turn away from her father. She did not lower her gaze. She did not retreat into the silence that had once defined her. She stood there, fully present, fully seen, not because someone had placed her there, but because she had chosen to remain. And in that moment, the room, the same kind of room that had once erased her, felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had, and that change could not be undone, not by memory, not by expectation, not by anyone who had failed to see her before. Her father gave a small nod, not agreement, not approval, but acknowledgement, the first real one he had ever offered. And then he turned, leaving as quietly as he had arrived, the space settling once more into stillness. But it was not the same stillness as before. It was fuller, grounded, real. Ma exhaled slowly, not releasing tension, but recognizing the absence of it. As she turned slightly, her eyes met Ji-hyun's, and there was no need for words, no need for confirmation, because everything that needed to be understood already had been. And in that quiet, steady moment, one truth remained clear and undeniable. She had never been less. She had only been unseen. And now, there was no place left for her to disappear. Not in this room, not in herself, not ever again. And that day, without announcement, without spectacle, the world around her adjusted to something it had always overlooked, dignity, finally standing where it had always belonged.